Hello and welcome to the Cult Vault podcast, your dedicated podcast for uncovering the darkest corners of cults and coercive control. I'm your host, Kacey, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for tuning in. Your support fuels our deep dives into these critical issues. Before we get started, a word of caution. Today's episode may contain discussions on abuse, including graphic descriptions of abuse, and covers a variety of human rights violations that may be triggering for some listeners. Please consider this as a trigger warning and proceed with caution. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025, and again in Manchester on the 27th of September 2025. Join me and a host of world-leading experts, advocates and noisemakers at the heart of the true crime community. This is the UK's biggest true crime event, and you won't want to miss it. Use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, for 10% off your tickets. And remember, there are flexible tickets and payment plans available to accommodate everyone. This incredible event is sponsored by True Crime, and it's always my favourite weekend of the year. I hope to see some of you there. And for those who want even more from the Cult Vault podcast, you can access early, ad-free content by supporting me at patreon.com/thecultvault, where every pledge not only gives you exclusive access, but also directly supports the continuation of this work. Thank you again for your support and your listenership. Now, let's unlock the vault. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey. And today's episode, I'm going to preface with a trigger warning. There are going to be themes within this episode of child sexual abuse, and our guest today is going to be recounting her experiences in 3 different cults. Not traditional cults, I don't think, that you might not instantly recognize as cult-like, but as you'll hear from our guest, the 3 different environments that she has managed to escape from do reflect cult-like tactics across each of them. So thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome, Brenda.
Hi, Kacey. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today and for rescheduling with me, because we were supposed to meet yesterday. Then I was going to go to a family dinner, but then my partner actually ended up in bed sick all day. So I wouldn't have been able to record even if we didn't reschedule. So all worked out. Maybe not for my partner, but so we are going to be talking about a group I've never talked about on the show before. We're also going to be talking about the dynamics of families and domestic situations. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, for sure. And again, thank you for having me. So my name is Brenda, and I'm here to share my story about childhood sexual abuse by the leader of a Toronto-based cult group called Students of Light, and enduring the effects of blame, shame, and diminishment of the abuse by cult leadership members and those closest to me. I was brought into the first cult at age 11 and remained there until age 28. And despite a lifetime marred by cruelty and failure of our justice system, I hope my story reflects resilience of the human spirit and our ability to find peace after trauma. I'm sharing my story because I found it very valuable in my own healing journey to listen to others and gain a better understanding of and perspective of what actually was happening to me and what happened to me. And so that's why I'm here today to talk to you.
Students of Light is a group that I hadn't heard of prior to our conversations. It's been a bit of a learning experience finding out about the Students of Light. There are many themes within the group that I found familiar in terms of the teachings and the period in history and similar groups in terms of the belief system. Would you mind telling the listeners who the Students of Light were, how the group started, what the doctrine was?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just back up a little bit before then. And I'm actually from Northern Ontario, a town called Sudbury. My parents who were never religious. They didn't want to save the planet. They weren't looking to be with kindred spirits, let's say, but they were somewhat lost in life. They were very young when they married and had their own trauma and turmoil that they brought to the marriage. So by age 10, my parents actually joined transcendental meditation. And our tiny little home really became the hub for meditation meetings and lectures and that sort of a thing. So we did that for about 18 months. And then one day my parents came home and said that they had attended just one lecture by a man named Kollmar, and he was touting his sort of new age rhetoric and gave this lecture that they were rather taken with. And they said, we're not going to be in transcendental meditation anymore. We're now going to be a part of his group. And quite a number, actually, of people. Short form for transcendental meditation is TM. So quite a number of members from TM actually decided to leave that group, TM, and become a part of Dawn's group. And it was called Students of Light. And he used to travel around Ontario and all throughout the United States. He was actually a U.S. citizen, but his group, the cult group, was situated in Toronto. So he would travel and set up satellite groups, sort of getting people interested in joining. And so he came to Sudbury twice before my parents introduced me and my sisters. I'm the middle of three daughters. When I met him, I was expecting to see someone who was a little bit like a Jesus figure. Everyone basically said that he was sent to us by God to help us grow spiritually. I envisioned someone who was, again, like Jesus. When I said hello, I was very shy, and he didn't say anything to me. He had looked stern. He was very, very tall and gangly. Was in his early 20s when I was 11, but he had salt and pepper hair, and he didn't say anything to me. And my sister and I didn't like him when we first met him, but nonetheless, he centered me out and said that, oh, she's very special. She's very pure. She's like a child Dalai Lama, and I would like to mentor her. This was only their second meeting, but they readily agreed, and from that moment on, gave him unfettered access to me. So when he would come to Sudbury, which was about twice a month, which was more than he went anywhere else, because I later found out that he was very taken with me at 11 and was traveling to Sudbury far more often than he did other places so that he could meet and mentor me. And he would just take me aside and have conversations. And the beginning was just sort of telling me about a little bit about his life, and it became very bragful on his part, very boastful. He started to tell me in these meetings that he was a very high being, that he was the oldest soul, one of the oldest, if not the oldest soul in the universe, that he was the new avatar come to save the planet. And what that means is sort of a spiritual person, a great being who comes to save the planet every 2,000 years or so, like Jesus or Moses or others before him. And so this was not information that he spoke about readily with other people, but he would tell me that he was connected with God and all the masters, all the ascended masters, and that when anyone, including me, asked him a question, he was so connected to God that it was God's answer would come through him. So it was like speaking to God. He said it was God's will that he mentor me, and that it was very important that he met me this young in this life so that he could strip me down to nothing and build me back up into the spiritual being that I was supposed to be in this lifetime. And I remember when he said those types of comments, it was like, well, what happened to the child Dalai Lama, as a child? Like, why does he have to strip me down? It was very confusing for me. He told me that everything I thought, said, and did was irrelevant and inconsequential, and that I needed to submit my will to him, because submitting my will to him was like submitting my will to God. And so if I ever felt any resistance to anything he told me to do, that it meant I was not only defying him, but I was defying God directly. He went on, there was so much more that he said, but was also told to me that if I speak about these, that everything he told me are spiritual secrets. And so if I ever speak about these things, I would be going against God, because people aren't ready to hear much of the things that he's telling me. And it would allow the darkness to work through me and sabotage God's plan for the world for me. And so I was very intimidated by him telling me all the time how powerful he was. that he was very psychic. He also said, I'm very psychic, and I know everything that you think and feel and do. So even when I'm not in his presence, he would know what I thought and felt. And so I had to constantly work to align myself with his way of thinking and remember that he's watching over me. He's watching me. That went on for about a year. And within a year, he then told my parents that I was because I was so special, it was time for me to start traveling with him by the time I was 13 so that I could learn how to teach meditation and do what he does, lecture and do aura balancing. So basically what the group was about is he taught that we were all together in previous lifetimes, and including at the time of Jesus, and that we failed basically at the time of Jesus to uplift the planet. And through working on ourselves and eliminating all the darkness within ourselves, we would help to raise the consciousness of the planet, to allow God and the light to come forth. We raised the consciousness of the planet so that it wouldn't be destroyed by man or environmentally or in any other way. And so we had this great responsibility in this lifetime to do that and be together. And in every lecture, he would always say, basically started out with, you're so special. You're very important beings. You are here because you've heard God's calling and you know how important this lifetime is. And if there was anybody throughout his lecture or that just in conversation with him, sort of disagreed with anything he said, he was very quick to tell them the same thing every time. And that was every time anyone asked this, well, why is this? Or can you explain that? And he would say, oh, you're not ready. You're clearly not ready to be responsible in this lifetime and do what needs to be done. You're not a true seeker. So therefore, there's no need for you to stay here. And he would basically eliminate anybody who was going to cause any type of dissension. And so the Students of Light, it was called Students of Light or Soul, the acronyms so well, because we were supposed to bring light to the planet. Dawn had a co-leader, John Haynes, who has passed, so I can use his last name. He was also in Toronto and had a health food store there. It was a very popular health food store in the 70s and 80s. John was in the Rosicrucians for quite some time, and so he sort of espoused that type of spirituality. They both did. It was the Rosicrucians, it was the Madame Blavatsky, late 1800 occultist stuff, some Carl Jung as well. And they actually met in the early 70s, went to India, he said. He told everyone he went to India for a few years, but I know through his passport that I was able to view through the extradition hearing, which we'll talk about later, that he was there just for 6 months. But he said he studied with the gurus and he came back to Toronto and met John, and they decided that they wanted to start a group of like-minded people. And that was the formation of it. They talked for a long time. And so John didn't really travel. He was, again, situated in Toronto, but Dawn was sent out sort of to bring in the flock. And one of the things that was really important that was done on a regular basis was something that was called aura balancing. And it's sort of like an energy cleansing, but the person would lie on the table and you would use pendulums, crystal pendulums and amethyst pendles, and you would they'd spin over the person to clear them of all the negative energy and open them up to receive the light and spiritual experiences. And so those would last for about an hour. That's how Don made his living. Everything was paid in cash. Actually, they were taught, both Don and John were taught that by a mystic in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And she was called Nevadel Hunter. She was known for channeling a particular being that had access to what was called the Akashic Records. And you're smiling, so I know you're familiar with that. And that's basically a universal account of every thought, word, deed that you've done in every lifetime, if you believe in multiple lifetimes. So people were encouraged to go and have a reading from her. My mom actually went. My dad didn't. He had to work, but my mom did. And she was told that she was Queen Nefertiti, that she was Lydia, the woman in purple from the Bible. She was told that My dad and her were Samson and Delilah. And so it was one of these things where people in the group believed that they were every important historical figure that ever lived, much like the times I've heard people talk over the years that, oh, I was Queen Nefertiti, and I think, oh my goodness. So everyone was very important. John, ultimately, it was kept a secret. I was one of the few people because I was close with Dawn, but John was told he was Jesus incarnate. So he was very important, and that's what we were here to do. He had a very important role in this lifetime. At the end near the end of my leaving, or in the 80s, John was actually thought to be God himself. So not only Jesus, but God as well. And we had a woman that channeled God, his higher self. So she would channel God, and you could have meetings with her and hear what God had to say to you directly. So even though Dawn would always tell me that he was, he could do that as well. So that sort of is the crux of what the group was about. Basically, it started with about 35 people or so, and you had to be invited to live in Toronto, but there were a lot of people who were asking, they felt it was a very important area and that there were special things happening, and they wanted to be close to Dawn and John and all the other group people. And so slowly people started moving to Toronto from all over the United States and in Ontario, and they left really successful lives. These were all very highly educated people, not all, but a lot of them were financially set, and they gave up everything to come to the dilapidated Junction area of Toronto, which is the west end of Toronto. It was considered really dilapidated and not a safe place to be, but people started to move there, and they opened up a vegetarian restaurant that was very successful. Anyone from Ontario or Toronto may remember the vegetarian restaurant on Yonge Street. We had every star that there was that would come by who was ever making movies. So it was it was very successful. And then we opened up a second one. But there were a lot of health-oriented businesses in the Junction. And the group still exists today. Many of the businesses are still there. It's under new leadership, though, a different name from Students of Light. It went from Students of Light to Beings of Light, and now it's a completely different name. So that kind of, I think, is the crux of what the group was about.
Wow, there is so much to unpack in all of that information that you've just given us. I was reading through your published article on your experiences and looking at all of the things that were standing out in terms of the kind of the framework of the group, in terms of Madame Blavatsky, the Akashic Records, saving the planet through kind of spirituality, bringing in a new age, reincarnations of really important people, having this internal grading system on kind of level of importance and hierarchy. I've written down, and now you've mentioned the health food stores and the restaurant, and I was just writing down the Source family and the Order of the Solar Temple and the Church Universal Triumphant, and all of these different groups that have like similar hallmarks of belief systems, all the way to Aleister Crowley and Satanists and, all of that influence from the Order of the Solar Temple in the 90s. So it's really interesting to me to always piece together groups that are similar but also completely different at the same time, which is a hard thing to explain to somebody that doesn't know much about cults or high demand groups. But with this individual in particular, this Don Kollmar, sometimes people always ask the question, did somebody know what they were trying to do when they started a cult? And in this instance, I think I would say yes. I think this person knew what he was trying to do. He prefaced everything in a way that basically protected him from any kind of scrutiny or any kind of whistleblowing or any kind of accusations, thought-terminating cliches, kicking people out if they questioned him, telling you, if you tell anybody or if you don't do the things that I want you to do, all of these things are going to happen. And this is before, everything does happen. So he knows exactly what he's going to do. And that's terrifying to be, such a small child in such a vulnerable position and singled out as well. So in terms of this individual, he targets you. You're the middle child. Do you have any kind of idea why you were singled out, or any reasons why he looked at you and decided that you were the person he was going to groom?
No, I can't answer that question other than to say what he told me, why he centered me out. And what he told me, again, by the time I was 12, in the midst of one of our meetings together, he took my hand and he said, Brenda, he said, I need to tell you something. God has given me permission to tell you this. And you're very young, but you're very wise and mature for your age. And so I'm going to tell you that we are soulmates, and you're a very old soul as well. And so, of course, I felt so self-conscious and uncomfortable and shy. What I had learned in TM was that soulmates, it didn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could be brother and sister, any family member, best friends, or teacher and student. And so I thought, oh, he must obviously mean the latter. He wouldn't be telling me that he's romantically attracted to me or there's anything there. I thought he meant student and teacher. And so in my shyness, I just let myself believe that. And so that was the reason he said he centered me out, because he was very taken aback. And the reason he didn't say hello to me was because he was so taken aback and he couldn't even speak. That was the reason. So it was really difficult because these meetings persisted. And then all of a sudden by 13 said, well, it's really important now that you start traveling with me. So he would travel and do all of his, or he would stay at people's homes. He had a white van that he traveled in for the first part that I knew him. He had a bed in there, so he would sleep on the road and travel. And we had, in Toronto, there was a house that the group owned that was called Soul House, Students of Light, the acronym. And that's where everyone had meditations and aura balances were held there. And so
whilst you're traveling with this man, do any of his clients say like, oh, is this your daughter? And what does he say? Yes, or does he say no?
Well, it's rather peculiar because when he spoke to my parents, he said, she's going to travel with me. She's going to be safe. And eventually what he told people was that because I was so young doing aura balances, that he wanted to say I was older so that people wouldn't say, why is a child aura balancing me? And I was, at a young age, I was fairly articulate and everyone would say, oh, you're so mature. But I was still a kid in every regard. Mentally, I was still a child. I could speak well because my family we were brought up to be, primped and perfect all of the time. It was very important that we presented like a beautiful, loving family. And I loved my family at the time. I loved them. We were close knit, but we always had to be perfect with our hair curled and outfits pressed and matched. And so he said that, so I presented a little bit older than what I was, but he said he was going to tell everyone that I was his 18-year-old friend that he was mentoring and teaching these techniques to. So I was introduced to everybody. I hadn't even started high school yet as an 18-year-old young woman. And it was a lot of pressure for me at 13 to try to behave like I was an 18-year-old and answer questions as though I was worldly in some way. And I always felt so on guard because eventually we'll get into it, but he would get very angry with me. So it was tough. But yeah, he would always say that I was 18 years old. So it was a way for him to, again, it was calculated. He didn't want to be questioned. Why are you traveling with a child? And so that was how he got around that issue.
Did you have any reservations about traveling with him? And did your parents have any reservations that you're aware of?
The first time I traveled with him was actually to a retreat that he said he wanted to take me on to Buffalo at his parents' home. And he sent this big envelope with this big invitation in it talking about a spiritual retreat. He had important things that God wanted him to share with me. And he gave it to my mom to give to me. She read it. And it had like a grade 7, a little piece of paper in it that said, attend or not attend, like yes or no, childlike. And I always felt embarrassed for him. And here I am, 13. And so I said, Mom, he wants me to go with him alone? And she said, yes, yes. I said, no, I want you to come with me. And she said, no, I'm not invited. It's an important spiritual retreat. So I go in your room and think about it. And so I went into my bedroom for about 15 minutes, pretending I was doing stuff, and I checked the no box. And when I came out and I said, I don't feel right about going, Mom. I'm too afraid. She got really angry with me and demanded that we get an eraser and erased my no check mark and said, it's all messy now. He's going to know that you said no. And she put a yes check mark and mailed it back to him and said, you have to tell him that you did that accidentally. I think wanted to impress my family and me. And so he purchased a plane ticket or paid for a plane ticket. I don't know how he put it into my parents' hands, but for me to fly it's only like a 45-minute flight from Sudbury to Toronto. And so he was going to meet me in Toronto, and we were going to drive in his van to his parents' home in Buffalo. And I felt forced, like I didn't have a choice and that this was God's will. And I really admonished myself for the whole time I was with him. But even then at 13, because he had told me any resistance you feel towards me, like to not listen to everything I tell you to do, means you're disobeying God. And so I had to admonish myself for my innate feelings of self-protection and repudiate them. Like I really suffered. That was probably one of the worst things, repudiating my own sense of self-protection over and over again, and just trying to numb myself out to my own fear and pain.
Yeah.
And so I get off the plane in Toronto, and he had, up until that point, he had always been, I'll say kind, and he never allowed himself to be upset or angry in my presence. He spoke to me gently. I never knew any other part of him except that he was intimidating because of the things he told me, but he was kindly. And when I got off the plane, I was, again, 13 years old. I had long curly hair all the time that, we had to curl. I was wearing a little bit of lip gloss, which I always did at 13. All my friends were. I had a pretty little new outfit on, but again, it was a skirt down to my knees and my, big sleeves. There was nothing sexual about what I was wearing at 13 years old. But when I came down the steps, I got halfway down, and all of a sudden he wouldn't give me eye contact. And of course, I felt like I was punched in the stomach. I knew something was wrong, and he wouldn't look at me. And as soon as I got down, he said, hurry up, we're late, we have to go. And he was so angry, and I was terrified of him from that moment on. And I thought, what is wrong? And he's taking big, long strides, and I'm trying to catch up with him. And I just said, is everything okay? Is everything okay? And he wouldn't answer me. I said, Dawn, are you okay? He spun around on his heel. His fists were clenched. And in front of everyone, he grit his teeth and whisper yelled at me, how dare you ask me how I am? Who do you think you are? How dare you? I'm fine. It's you. Look at your hair. You knew this was a spiritual weekend, how important it was. You've curled your hair. You should be so ashamed and embarrassed. You're wearing lip gloss and attention-seeking clothes. You are sexualizing yourself. How dare you? And he said, you're never allowed to curl your hair again, and listed other things. And that was how this retreat started. We get to his parents' house, and I asked him, are your parents in the group? And he said, no. He said, not at all. He had a very hard time with his mom, he said, at some point in the future, he told me. But he found a key. He said, my parents don't know we're here, but it's my parents' house, and so we're going to have a retreat here. And this is a very important moment in your life. God has told me I can tell you many things. And so we have to start this off right. We walked in, and within 15 minutes, he said, I need to work on you today and tomorrow before I reveal certain secrets. And so I need you to we're going to meditate. You have to be spiritually ready, physically, emotionally and mentally ready, and physically ready and open to receive this important information. He set up a massage table and told me to take my clothes off, and that he had to give me a therapeutic massage so that I would be ready to receive this information and physically relaxed. From that moment on, I just went into a state of shock. I didn't know what to do. He said, I'm not going to look at you. I'll use a sheet. But of course, he removed the sheet, and so massaged me for about 2 hours. And when I turned over, this was something he ended up doing all of the time after this point. But he said, you're so sexual that you attract men's attention. So it was my fault. Men were inappropriate with me. And to be honest, I was very well endowed for my age. So they were inappropriate. And he said, you're carrying all of their sexual energy in your breasts. So I need to massage your breasts to get rid of this sexual negative energy. And he proceeded to massage my breasts in such a violent manner that at the end, by the next day, and often they were very bruised. And when I was wincing in pain, he said, you see, you're feeling pain because you're so resistant to me. You're going to use this pain as a barometer for you to know how resistant you are towards me. You need to submit your will to me. And if you did that, you wouldn't feel the pain. Well, I was 13 and developing, so it was very painful. And he did that all the time. I always had bruised breasts from him. So that's how I started traveling. And so there was no one at that retreat. It was just the two of us, and my parents were fine with him taking me there. They thought he was the spiritual being. They didn't assume that something like this would happen. But nonetheless, you can never be too protective of your parents of your children, because these things happen far, far too often. And so, but they were, we were very independent children. It wasn't like my parents monitored our lives all that much. So even when before I started traveling with him, we made a trip as a family to Toronto to meet John for the first time, the other co-leader. And it was the soft opening of the restaurant. So it was about 1975. I was 12 at the time. And we were supposed to go there for a day and meet other Toronto group people for the first time. Don invited us, and he said, come for the soft launch of the restaurant. And so we got there. And when we knocked at the door, and the group people were they were not the nicest people. Often they were quite cruel. And so she said, well, I don't know why you came. John may have invited you, but you're not welcome here. And she just closed the door on my whole family. So Don had to come and let us in. Anyway, long story short, we were supposed to go camping afterwards, and my parents said, no, you're going to stay here and work in the restaurant, to my older sister and I. And I was 12, my sister was 13, and my sister started to cry and said, I don't want to stay. We're supposed to, where are we supposed to go? Well, and a woman said, oh, you can stay with me at my apartment. But there was not a lot of protection. And so my sister's crying, saying, please don't leave us. Please don't leave us. And she's got her hand on the car door, and my dad starts to drive off, and she's screaming, pounding at the door, and they're saying, stop, control yourself. And they rolled their windows up and took off, and she was left in this plume of smoke, and she turned around just in a state of shock. She did not want anything to do with the group, but they were always trying to encourage her. So they left us in Toronto for several days by ourselves to fend for ourselves. So there was not a lot of protection there. And so when Kollmar said, I want to take and mentor her and travel with her, they gave him unfettered access to me, basically no questions asked. And so that was my life for the next, until I was almost 17 years old. And so in this, just sort of the genesis of where everything happened for me was on that Buffalo trip. And it was excruciating because it was the first time I witnessed his Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, his unprovoked, rage-filled rants. He would completely lose control of himself. And especially when you're talking about, I was a very shy, timid child. I was very polite. Respected my elders. And so there was no reason for him to be upset or anything. I didn't do anything. It was, no matter how hard I tried to placate him through the years, it didn't matter. He was going to move the goalposts or there were so many false accusations. It's the same story over and over again in intimate partner violence. It's the same thing. Nothing you do is right. But this is where it all started. And he told me, after massaging me, we meditated. And then he said, he knew my sisters and I were proficient in dance. And he said, I want you to dance for me. And I was so shy. I just said, I'm too shy to dance, if that's okay. And he blew up and said, you're selfish. You're self-centered. You're denying me pleasure. And so under those circumstances, I had to make up a balletic, modern, interpretive style dance for him, which he cried after and said, I had no idea you were so talented. And then every time I saw him, which was usually twice, though, almost every weekend, and then I traveled with him during every school holiday, he would make me dance for him. But very soon on, he would make me dance in my underwear or my bathing suit, and then he would make me dance naked for him. And so my love of dance was decimated. To this day, I've never been able to get up on a dance floor and woohoo, let's have some fun. It's still there for me. I feel so self-conscious. So that part of my life was devastated. But all of a sudden, he started during a meditation. He said, okay, I need to talk to you about things. And he started to completely run down my family and tear them apart and tell me how physical they were. They were holding me back spiritually, and they are no longer my family. He is my family, and I must unite only with him because they have nothing left to teach me in this life. And it's his duty and job assigned by God to mentor me, and I have to unite only with him. He completely tore apart even my little 10-year-old sister, and I started to cry. I couldn't breathe. I was so horrified again. I loved my family. I was very close with them. So I'm being told that I can't spend time with them, that I can't have friends because it is a distraction from my spiritual growth. And so in this he just started raging about them and was angry that I was close to them. So he said, all of a sudden he flipped from maniacal into being all excited and happy, almost giddy, saying, I can tell you now what the secret is. I thought I had to wait till you were 16 to tell you this, but God said, I can tell you now. And that is that because we are soulmates, I'm going to marry you as soon as you turn 16. And I felt the universe just crashed down on me. I had such horror. I wasn't interested in boys at all. I had no interest in boys yet. I was a late bloomer in that sense. I had never held hands with a boy. I had never gone on a date. And all of a sudden, I'm being told I have to marry this man. I was terrified. I was horrified. I cannot tell you the emotions that ran through me, except that it felt like the earth cracked and the universe just fell down on me. The weight was so heavy. And so he said that we're not allowed to tell anyone yet because the world isn't ready to know, and the world will be lifted in consciousness to such a high level by our souls uniting and marrying. And he said, your family can't come though because they're too low in consciousness, so they're not allowed to come, but we're not allowed to say anything, and I will tell you when it's time for us to be allowed to say something. And I went home after that in basically a state of shock, and I was so desperate to tell my sister. I was screaming inside. I mean, it was like this loud scream. Tell her, say something. And I tried with all of my might to push these words out of my mouth, but they were just, nothing would come out. It was like I would open my mouth and no words would come out. And that's what I experienced the whole time I was with him. My sexual abuse didn't come out until in my 20s. And I was with him for 5 years until I was almost 17, but I couldn't say anything. And from there, he said that I had to start traveling to Toronto on a regular basis, almost every weekend, to supposedly spend time with the group and be close to John Haynes and everyone there. And so my parents would send me off. It was exhausting because I had to, from school on Friday nights or sometimes Thursdays, because he would have me miss school all the time. I missed so much school. I had to take a coach bus from Sudbury to Toronto, which was 5 hours. And then it would take me sometimes almost an hour to take a subway and a bus to Soul House, which I had no time for homework, nothing like that. And so I would get to Soul House and I was instructed to go to his van where he would usually ask me how I was doing and how he thought I was doing. And that would be an excuse for him to berate me and tell me that I wasn't being spiritual enough, that everything that I was doing wrong. It really got bad with his berating me very quickly. So it was a sense of you're lazy, you're a piece of shit, you're worthless. I mean, he would go into these rants of everything under the sun, just accusing me of everything. And so I would just sit there and try not to let him see me cry, but I wanted to cry. And he said, you've got to change all of these things And again, it was always about submitting my will to him. And then he would make me take all my clothes off, and he would berate me either in the middle of a hotel room or in his van. He would berate me as I sat naked in a chair. And at one point early on, I remember crossing my arms because I felt so self-conscious. And he was infuriated with that and said that I'm closing myself off to him. And so I had to sit there with my hands just dangling at my side as he berated me sometimes for, rarely was it ever just 10 minutes. It was usually, we're talking hours of the repeated same things that he would tell me, just very cruel, vicious things. And then I would have to apologize to him over and over again and ask for his forgiveness. And generally it was the same thing. It was ritualistic almost, because he would say, I feel so much better getting all of that off my chest, Brenda. You don't know how hurt I am from the things that you do and all of this type of thing. And then he would rape and molest and rape me. So this happened almost every weekend for years. And then when I traveled with him as well. And then I would have to take a bus back, a subway, and then the coach bus back to Sudbury. And I had to walk most of the way. I had to walk home, which was about a 25-minute walk. And often it was on a part of a highway that there was no sidewalk. And I would get home and be exhausted. I asked him once if I could study for a test or write an essay that was due, and was so infuriated with me and said, you must be so stupid if you don't have enough time to and from. You have to have basically 10 hours every weekend to do that. But I don't know if you've ever been on a bumpy coach bus. It's very hard. It's hard to read, study, write. You certainly can't write. And that was my life for 5 years, to and fro. And I would get home and I'd have to try to catch up with homework. And again, my parents, there was no oversight. I was never asked if I was okay. I was never asked, how are you doing homework? When are you doing homework? I just kept being sent. And well, I could go on and on about that. I can tell you later a little bit more maybe about the trips we took. But yeah, so people thought I was older, and that's how he got around people questioning.
Gosh, Brenda, I mean, through all of the work that I've done on trying to understand coercive and controlling behavior and the the thought reform and indoctrination that takes place within these groups, and I try, as somebody that doesn't have lived experience in a cultic environment, to have as much understanding and compassion as I possibly can, and understand moral injury and understand why certain people might make certain decisions in cults. But it's so hard for me to hear about your parents in this way. It's so hard for me to hear about them leaving you at this restaurant when your sister is screaming for them to stay and they just drive off. That's so hard for me to hear, that they let you go with this man. And I know that there's reasons that happens. I think every parent wishes that, thinks their child is like, I think my children are the most special children in the world. I think that they're so smart, so clever. If somebody told me like, oh, they're going to, be responsible for lifting the world into a high state of consciousness, I'd be like, yeah, I think you're telling me the truth, So I can kind of understand it from that perspective, as two people that are seeking enlightenment and are being told by somebody that they believe to be enlightened that their daughter is also one of these people, and this person can help her reach levels that they'll never be able to reach. You always want the best for your children, better than you had. But it's even kind of trying to understand it from that perspective, it's so hard to hear about them not questioning, that your school aren't questioning, why is Brenda missing school? Why isn't Brenda completing her homework? And talking about the way that this man was able to groom your parents by telling them all of these things about you before he then requested their permission to take you away with an invitation and a plane ticket And then when you arrive, it's like he doesn't have to love bomb anymore. He doesn't have to pretend anymore. He's just going to give you his wrath, his anger.
Exactly.
So the mask slips off. I've heard people marry people, and then as soon as they're married, like the mask comes off and the control starts, and it's like, where I did not even know this person existed.
Yeah.
But then to take you to his parents' house and his parents aren't there, you know, you're then physically isolated, and then he's psychologically isolating you by saying all these awful things about your family and how he's going to be your family from now on. And how it escalates so quickly in that weekend to sexual violence makes me think that there's a time where your life was probably in jeopardy, Brenda. Like your, not just your autonomy and your safety and, you know, your just your spirituality, everything, like your actual life was in danger for the way that this escalated so fast.
Yeah, I did feel in danger, but I didn't understand what it was. I was too young, and for a lifetime, I never blamed my parents. It's heartbreaking because I know my mom has said, well, recently, if Brenda could just forgive us, I don't know how she could, but if she did, you know, then we would have a relationship. And it breaks my heart because I've always loved my parents. I've only shown them respect and love, and I never blamed them. Until recently, I've come to realize they did have a responsibility to protect me. And it was always put back on me for a lifetime that I constantly was told, but you wanted to go, Brenda. I remember you wanted to go. And so that responsibility was put back on me, and I had a lifetime of that. And so only within the last few years have I come to terms with, you know, I had these big rose-colored glasses on that, no, you had a responsibility, but I have forgiven them over and over and over again. It is nothing to do with forgiveness. It's just to do with my self-dignity, my self-validation that I was abused horribly. And it was not my fault. It wasn't because at no point did I want to go. No one asked me. I was told I had to go. And then when parents don't intervene and say, hold on, when they see certain things, when they witness certain things, like the danger was certainly there, and things happened in front of my parents that I can share in a moment. But the danger, it was, I think, my second trip with him to Montreal, where we went to a restaurant and he told me that he wanted me to get dressed up nicely. And he said, bring a nice dress. And he said, bring, you know, I didn't wear makeup, but he said, bring your lip gloss and your mascara. He told me to. And so I packed that. And he said, I want you to curl your hair, because I was not allowed to curl my hair anymore, right? So he said, I want you to curl your hair. And my mom was aware of this, and she packed my rollers for me. And so we got dressed up to go to a restaurant. And as soon as we walked in, he just did that whole Dr. Jekyll, whatever it's called. It's Dr. Jekyll was dried. And he wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't look at me. And he was very, very curt with the waiter. And I couldn't eat because I was so sick in my stomach. And the waiter said, you know, are you okay? Is everything okay? You're not enjoying your meal? I said, oh, no, I'm fine. And then he threw money on the table. He got up and he left. And I wasn't done eating. And I excuse me, let me just back up a bit. What I said to him was, I said, Dawn, is everything okay? And I dared to ask him, is everything okay? And then I said, are you okay? And again, he laced into me that, how dare you? Do you know who I am? He used to tell me that he's king, that people think he's like a king to his people. Don't you know who I am type thing. How dare you ask me that? And he threw money on the table. He left, and we got back to the motel room. He told my parents I would have my own motel room, but of course I didn't. And I was not allowed to tell them anything about what happened, what he said. He always said it was, you know, this is what God wants, and you're ever going to tell anybody, no one will believe you if you tell them anyway, because I'm like a king to these people. So no one would believe you. They would believe me. And we get back to the motel room, and it was almost like an evil, it wasn't almost, an evil presence. I don't know any other word. The darkness, the room became dark, and it was thick. The atmosphere was thick with this terrifying evil presence. And he started to scream and yell at me that I was flirting with the waiter. How dare you behave like this? And he made me sit down in a chair. And this is when he started to really threaten to hit me with his fists, like flailing inches in front of my face. You're so lucky I have self-restraint. I want to hit you hard enough to leave marks. You're lucky I don't. And so that threat of physical violence was always there. He did slap me in my face. He did violently twist my wrists regularly and twist it so violently that my whole body had to contort, in the direction of the twist. And he would hold me there for minutes at a time as he screamed and yelled. So there was definitely a violence. I did feel fear for my physical well-being along with my spiritual well-being. And so, and so these types of things when he was controlling with everything. And my parents would allow a lot to go on in front of them. I'm jumping around a little bit, but he immediately started that I had to change my diet. I had to become a vegan, and I was the first in my family to become vegetarian. And then he said I had to be a vegan, and I'm a growing child, and this was Sudbury. We didn't have health food stores with all sorts of, supplemental food that I could eat. So it was really hard, and my mom was frustrated about that. But she never said to me, Brenda, I don't know what to get you to eat, but I'm going to talk to Dawn. You're going to eat what we eat. I'm going to cook you a meal. It was never that. It was like, oh, I've got to do this now. I've got to do that. I had to fast at least once a week. I used to grow my own sprouts on the counter all the time, alfalfa sprouts, so that I would have food to eat. He would buy vitamins for me. I had to take quarts of vitamins and big, massive tablespoons of liquid lecithin. I don't know if you've ever had liquid lecithin. It would be what thick car oil tastes like, if you can imagine. That's the only thing I can imagine. So I had to take that all the time. And then again, they never intervened in any of that. But I had to fast at least once a week. And then when I was with him, because I was with him for long stretches often, he would make me fast most of the times I was with him on trips. But for 2 weeks at a time, I would have to fast. And so I would be so hungry. He would he would disallow me any water for 24-hour periods. I was never out of his presence. When I was with him, it was rare that I was ever out of his presence. So I wasn't allowed to drink even a sip of water because he wanted me to practice becoming an Eritrean. And he just had controlled every aspect of my life. I had to meditate from 3 to 4 in the morning in the middle of the night. And my sister would beg me, would you please not wake up? He'll never know. But I said, no, I'm afraid he'll know. So I had to meditate during the holy hour, 3 to 4. I would meditate from 10 to 11 at night, and then he would call every night. And I was so afraid because when he would call, he would berate me over the phone about things he thought I did or felt. And so I was being berated by him. This was every single night. I didn't have a reprieve. And so my parents said, it's really interfering. It's really interfering. He's calling, he's got to call by 10:30 and no later. But they did. So my meditation was cut in half. And then I would make excuses up. I would say, please tell him. I'd say I was on the toilet with bad cramps. Please tell him I can't come to the phone. And they would be annoyed. Either my sisters or my mom would be annoyed with the holding the phone. He's waiting. So I was trying to give little signs. So I was never free of him. And then he bought this uniform for me. It was a very senior citizen style outfit because he felt that I was being too sexual all the time, which, 13, 14, 15, you're not being sexual. And I had to wear this for 2 years. And instead of my mom saying, this is ridiculous, I literally had to wear it every day for school. I had to wear it in anything that I did after school, to every event, and to every day that I traveled with him. I had one uniform with these dowdy little, shoes. And he bought me socks and pantyhose, and I had a big run of my pantyhose that I was wearing to school every day. And my sister said, change your pantyhose. But I said, no, I'm too afraid. And my mom would be mad at me saying, you're not wearing that uniform again, are you? Dawn will never know. Just here, wear something else. But it was put back on me that it wasn't, you don't have to wear this. He'll never know. But I was terrified because I felt he would know. And I was also terrified because I found out by 14 that he asked my parents regularly what was happening. They reported everything back to him.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there was an incident with my dad where my dad got really angry with me. And I said, Dad, please don't tell Dawn about this. I was just afraid he was going to tell Dawn. I don't know why. It was a fear I had. And he said, well, of course I'm going to tell him. I'm not going to lie to him. He asks all the time, and I'm not going to lie to him. It was the first time I felt betrayal. I didn't know what that emotion was, but I felt so betrayed and so sad that I didn't feel like there was anywhere for me to turn. So this sort of control in my life was an everyday event. It wasn't just when I was traveling with him. It was when I was at home as well.
Yeah.
And he's in Toronto, so, a lot of that time.
Absolutely every single facet of your entire existence at that point is being controlled, monitored, surveilled, and fed back to this guy.
Yeah, for sure.
My gosh, Brenda, I can't breathe. I can't breathe listening to it. It's like everywhere. It's everything. And I mean, you have no advocates at that point. So that's got to be so tough, You're getting it from both sides as well. You're getting berated from your parents about the guy that's also berating you for, setting impossible tasks, setting impossible goals. Because, he wants to, I've been using this term abusement. He wants to humiliate you because that's obviously doing something for him. And it's hard. It's really hard for me to still hear about these stories with your parents. Does he ask them if he can marry you at some point?
So I had spent the last, all of these years from the time I was 12 to the time I'm almost 16, going with him. And it was, I went from a very vibrant, pretty young girl to a downtrodden, mousy young teenager that was, quite frankly, unrecognizable when I look at pictures. Because again, he set so many rules where I wasn't allowed, again, at home. We had been brought up to be very perfect, curl our hair, look a particular way all the time. And so my family continued with that. There was no heavy involvement with my family. My parents went to meditation. My mom often didn't, but my dad went to meditation once a week at someone's house to meditate with the Sudbury group. But outside of that, they made a few trips to Toronto. They were not heavily involved in the group at this point at all. And yet I'm being sent off constantly, missing every vacation. I died inside because I couldn't see them all of these times, for special holidays and time off school. And my sister distracted me so much to have her come.
Don't worry, please don't apologize either, because I make notes as we go through, so I'll always take us back if we get off track. But we're just talking about marriage proposals.
Right. So I wasn't allowed to, some of the rules were I wasn't allowed to brush my hair more than once a day. And it was first thing in the morning, and it was only 10 strokes. And I couldn't look in the mirror more than once a day except doing that. When I was with him, he was very controlling. He would take my brush away even. And he wouldn't allow me to shower sometimes for 2 weeks at a time, even though he showered daily. Did a lot of that type of stuff. He controlled when and if I could use the bathroom. And sorry, I'm just going back to just a couple of more abuses that happened along the way. But just before I turned 16, he came to Sudbury, and it was my birthday. And so we all went out to a restaurant, and my family and he were all dressed up. And there I was in my little dowdy uniform, stringy hair. And he said that he didn't even tell me that this was going to be the time he would announce it, but he just announced it to my parents. He said, well, I have something very special to tell you. It's God's will that Brenda and I are soulmates and we're going to be married. And I just went into a state of shock because he hadn't prepared me that he was going to tell them. And they all looked at me very surprised, of course. They had no idea that this was going to happen. My older sister was horrified, and my parents accepted it. I mean, there was some chatting about it, but they accepted it, no problem. And I was just there smiling quietly, and we went to the bathroom at one point, and they said, oh, Brenda, do you really want to, is this what you want? And I didn't know how to say, no, please someone rescue me. Please someone save me. I liken it to feeling kidnapped in broad daylight. I felt like I was being kidnapped, and there was nothing I could do about it, and no one was rescuing me. No one was saving me. And I knew at that point that everything felt so hopeless. He had not only physically and emotionally and mentally and sexually abused me. It was, I couldn't fathom that this would be the rest of my life. It terrified me that this is what I was going to live, and he would always talk about when we turn 60 years old, we're going to be old together. And that just terrified me. And so at that point, I felt so numb. But I always had this scream inside of me that I need to get out of this. And I looked everywhere for a way out, but I didn't know how to do that. There was no one that I felt like that I could turn to. I was so isolated because I didn't have friends in school anymore. I didn't have a connection with any teachers or any other adults. All the adults around me were in the group, and they revered this man, including my parents. Continued to travel with him. His level of cruelty, it constantly demeaning and debasing me. It was hard enough to hear the things that he would say, but it was the physical part of it, again, forcing me to sit naked while he did this. It was so humiliating. And he would tell me what he would say, it was the antithesis to how I was, that I am so selfish and that I have to make this up to him and that I have to start being affectionate to me. He would yell and scream at me and then tell me, come here, get here now, kiss me, do this. And it was this horror story that I was living. And so even when I would use the washroom, he would come in and watch me use the washroom. I had no reprieve from him ever because I was so self-conscious. I wouldn't be able to defecate in front of him. I held it in. And so he said, that's a problem. Like you should be going to the bathroom, but I only had 5 minutes to do it. And he would yell and scream at me if I wasn't on time and a minute to urinate. And so he said, we have to start giving you enemas. And so he said, and this was back when I'm 14. And so he said, this will help you. You have a lot of darkness in you, and that's why you're not going to the washroom properly, and that these enemas will help on a physical level to get rid of the darkness. And so he would make me undress and lie in the bathtub on my back with my knees up to my chin. And that's how he would give me the enema. He used cold water. He used a lot of it, and it was excruciating for me because I did have issues. I did have irritable bowel, I'm sure, at that time. So it was very painful, and he would force me to hold it for such a long time, sometimes up to an hour, but generally 30 minutes at least. But when you feel, and so he was forcing me to keep it in, and I would say, I can't, and I would be on the verge of throwing up. And then he would say, okay, stand up in the bathtub and you can release the water now. And so he was very perverse in that sense. And then even after that, sometimes he still wouldn't let me shower. And I would be desperate. I would plead with him, and I'd have, there were times where I came home and I had very greasy hair, and my sister would say, my God, Brenda, what's wrong with you? You need to take a shower. And she told my mom in front of me more than once, Mom, something's wrong. Like, what the hell's going on? I was desperate to shower, so I would go up and shower. But he would also lock me, again, things that would happen in front of my family where they never said anything. There wasn't a sense of protection. And they're letting me, without question, they're going to let this man take me away and marry me. When he would come, he was at the house at least once or twice a month, and he would sort of take over the whole house. And there were cracks that happened very early on in his persona. His true nature, he couldn't hold on to being this kind, loving, wise, higher echelon being that he was trying to emanate all the time. And so he would get annoyed. He would get a little bit irritated with people at times. And he did that with my mom a number of times at the house. He was very curt, and he thought very lowly of them anyway. They were holding me back from my spiritual growth. And so he was rude. There were times he was very rude. And my mom would come to me and say, you got to tell him to stop being so rude. You got to tell him. And I'd be terrified. And I would say, Mom, it's hard for me. It's hard for me. Well, I know sometimes he does that to me too, but she never came forward and said, what do you mean he does that to you too? And month after month, she would be upset that I hadn't yet spoken to him and angry with me. But he would lock me in the room all day for up to 12 hours at home and say, she has a lot of inner work to do. She's got to work on herself. And so I would be stuck in a room for 12 hours, a room that I shared with my sister, and she wasn't allowed to go in. They would all be having their lunch and dinner and walking around. And I was stuck in this room for the entire day, and no one came in and said, are you okay, Brenda? It was just expected that, you're working spiritually. So it's okay, So no one, again, there was not that sense of protection. And there was a really difficult situation that happened. There was a group retreat. We owned land. They owned land in Belmont. And so we went there for a 2-week retreat. Half the group the first week, half the group the second week. My parents were there the second week. And again, Kollmar was being very cruel to me, as he always was. And when my parents were there, he was angry that my mom and I were uniting in consciousness and attacking him and affecting his ability to, he always had these excuses, affecting his ability to give a lecture and to do this retreat. And so he said, you have to spend the next 24 hours in this storage room, little storage, it was like a 6x6 little storage closet. And he said, you're not allowed to talk to anyone, come out. There was a bathroom across from it, and he said, you can use that not more than twice in the 24-hour period. He said, and I'll be watching, I'll be checking, so I'll know if you open that door. So halfway, and he told me that I wasn't allowed to talk to my parents. That was the other thing. You're not allowed to talk to them or spend time with them. Knowing that they would be hurt, I whispered to them that Dawn wants me to be silent on this retreat. I just made this up because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. And so they seemed hurt when I told them that. And that I hadn't seen them all summer. It was this summer when I was 15. It was the first time. It was near the end. It was the end of the summer. And I had not seen them once or called because he said it was unnecessary. And my parents agreed to that I didn't have to call them, that if there was an issue, he would call them. So I was so isolated. And anyway, so they were hurt, I could tell. But I was locked in this room, and then I hear a knock on the door after maybe 12 hours. And it's I didn't say anything. And my mom says, Brenda, are you in there? And I finally said, Mom, is Dawn anywhere around? And she had to convince me that he wasn't, but I wouldn't open the door because I was so terrified he would come by and see that I opened the door. And so she said, no, he's nowhere here. I said, Mom, I can't open the door. He told me I'm letting the darkness work through me and I have to work on myself. I'm sorry. He told me I'm not allowed to open the door. And she said, okay. And she walked away. And then,
gosh.
yeah. And then at the end of the summer, when I actually did get home, it was within a week that I was back home. He came with me and I was starting school. And when Dawn left, both her and my dad, my sister told me that I was in a lot of trouble with them as well. But they, not only when I came back, but for many, many years afterwards, I heard about how rude and obnoxious I was and how I mistreated them. And that they were so upset with me for being so rude and never talking, to them, and that I didn't open the door. And this was something my mom was so upset about for years, that I didn't open the door. But the truth of it was that I was terrified to open the door. I couldn't. So there wasn't that sense of protection or someone that I could go to for help. They were very tuned out.
You turned 16 and the big wedding is supposed to go ahead. How does that unfold in terms of your reluctance and his obsession?
So I was not allowed to display any reluctance. He would get angry with me because I held myself so stiff when he molested me, and that I never came up to him and gave him hugs and kissed him and acted like his girlfriend at 14 years old. So I learned to cover my true feelings, and I never said a word that was negative towards him. So I had to act like this was something that I wanted. But again, I'm dying inside. And so by time I was in grade 10, the beginning of grade 10 when he announced the marriage. And by the end of grade 10, I was writing my last exam. And I didn't know how I was going to get out of it. He had told my parents that it was a very important day and that the only attendees at the wedding would be John Haynes, the co-leader, and then another woman that was in the core group. The only two allowed. So my parents weren't even going to be allowed, or my sisters, which again devastated me. And he said it would be because, we don't want anyone's consciousness interfering or the darkness interfering. So they weren't even going to attend. But he said, we'll go for a nice dinner afterwards. And so that was that. And I'm rolling around. I was supposed to be moving with him at the end of my once I graduated grade 10, finished my exams. Within a day, I was going to be moving there. And he it's like no one asked me about, okay, so what dress are you going to wear? Or like there was absolutely no conversation. Everyone was tuned out. No one asked me a question. And I think everyone was on pins and needles. Like, is this really happening? What the hell is going on? But again, my parents didn't say anything. So I had my uniform. I was going to wear my little dowdy uniform that I had worn already for 2 years. And I, again, was not allowed to look at myself in the mirror. I wasn't allowed to even look at teachers or boys, either in public or at school. He was always very angry with me. I had to keep my eyes averted in some way and, don't look at them in the eyes. So I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, which I wasn't supposed to look at, but I had bent down and I think was getting up and I caught a glimpse of myself. And I was so horrified because I did not recognize who I was. I was in such agony. I had disassociated, I think, from my true essence, from who I was. And there was nothing left there. And I was focusing my eyes and I could not recognize the person looking back at me. And I started to hyperventilate and I fainted. And when I came to, there were teachers around me. My mom was called. An ambulance took me to the hospital. But while I was lying on the floor in the bathroom, my mom was there. And I had been so terrified to ever say anything, but I knew that this was going to be the last moment I had a chance to escape. I had tried to escape once from him before in South Carolina. We were in the middle of nowhere. And again, I had this constant voice in my head screaming, just run, just tell someone. It was all the time. And I couldn't take it anymore. And I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to go and I'm going to run to the nearest house. I'm going to flag the nearest car down. And I quietly, because I was in his van where we would sleep when we were traveling, I got up and I thought, if he wakes up, I'm going to say I'm just going to the bathroom. He had a little portable toilet that he would set up just outside where we would park in like little parkette areas, anywhere that, if he needed to sleep. I would say, I'm just going to the bathroom. But I so gingerly got up. I grabbed my little nightie from the end of the bed. I didn't even grab my shoes because I was too afraid it would wake him up. And I pressed, I go out so quietly. I gently pressed the van door closed. And I just started to run. I slipped my nightie on in my bare feet in the middle of nowhere. And I had no sense of direction. I just was running. It was a country road and no one came. I ran for an hour. There was no one around. There wasn't a gas station, a house, like literally nothing. And then I turned around and I realized, oh my God, I could see. Well, it wasn't dawn. It was maybe 4:00 in the morning, but there was slight light coming up on the horizon. And then the panic in me started. I'm going to be in so much trouble. I just had terror fill me, and I ran back to him in the van, hoping he wasn't up yet because I didn't want to have to endure his wrath. And I thought, as soon as I got there, I thought, I'm going to tell him I want to go home. You have to take me home. And I went in with all this bravado, like, I'm going to tell him. And I stepped into the van and he was still asleep. And as soon as I looked at him, everything from me just faded. I felt like Novocaine had been injected into my bloodstream and brain, and I went numb and I couldn't say a word. I couldn't tell him. So that was one time I did try to escape unsuccessfully. But this, I knew fainting in the bathroom was my one last chance. And I whispered to my mom, please, Mom. I finally found the courage and I felt so elated to be able to say the words, Mom, he's so mean to me. He's going to be mad. Don't tell him. He's going to be so mad. Mom, I don't want to be with him. And she said, okay. I said, Mom, I don't want to marry him. And the words just flew out of my mouth. And it was the most relieving experience. I was just filled with joy at that moment that, okay, I've said it. I'm going to be saved. And so we get to the hospital, and a few hours later, Kollmar bursts through the hospital doors. And he instructs everyone there, my parents, that they have to leave because he has to work on me, that obviously the darkness is attacking me because of the marriage and it's so meaningful to the world. So he has to work on me spiritually. So they have to leave. And they left. And for 2 days, I laid in the hospital bed. I've been, the whole time I'm speaking, I mean, it's not always easy to talk about these things, but when I think about that, I get choked up in my throat because I couldn't believe that they left me with him.
And I wanted to let him stay as well. Like, there are so many other people in this story that are on the periphery that should have done something, that should have seen something, that should have recognized that something wasn't right, you know? There are a lot of people that I imagine, even these people that are supposed to believe you're 18 years old when you're traveling with this man, like there are so many people. Sorry.
I wanted to rip my skin off. It is without exaggeration when I say I wanted to rip my skin off. And there were times I was with him that I would dig my fingernails so deep into my hands or arm and cause blood because I couldn't take the pain, the fear, the agony when he would be berating me. But people in the group, again, they were not kindly people because I'll go back to the hospital in a moment, but people did see. I mean, there was a time that we were fasting and people knew we were fasting. I was traveling with him. It was in Georgia, I think. And he told me I had to meditate. And it was one of the few times I had alone that I was separate from him. He had to go do something. People were working on his van and I was sitting there meditating for about an hour and I was starving. I had been fasting for days and there was a bowl of almonds on the table and I pretended that I was just going to the bathroom. Again, I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom without his permission, but he wasn't there and I really had to go. So as I went by the table, I just snuck one as quickly as I could and I chewed it in the bathroom and I rinsed my mouth out because I was so afraid he would smell it on me. And went back and I thought I was safe. I had my one almond. And then at dinner time, again, he would tell me only, like every morning, he would tell me if I had to fast. He never said, okay, you're going to fast for this many days. It was always, I would say, Dawn, can I eat and drink today? You know, that was the level of control he had. No, you're fasting today. And today's a day you're not going to have water either. And so, again, it was a day I was supposed to be fasting. And then in the middle, or dinner's served and he starts eating and he had told me he was going to fast as well, but he starts filling his plate up and I'm sitting there. I had water only. I was allowed water that day. And he said, what, you're not eating, Brenda? I said, oh, I thought we were fasting. He said, why don't you apologize to all these people? You need to apologize to all of them. Why are you lying? Why are you lying? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he just continued berating me in this way. And there was about 12 adults sitting at the table, this big, long table. Not one of them said a word. They all just sat there and listened to him berate me. And then I had to apologize to all of them. Thought, does he psychically know I ate the almond? Is that why? And so I had to apologize to all of them for lying to them. And I sat there and no one offered me food. So I didn't eat. And then afterwards, back in his van, he was so irate that I embarrassed him. He would always tell me that I embarrassed him and how, you know, humiliated I should feel about myself. And so he said that someone reported me. A woman had seen me take the almond. So she reported me. It wasn't that he said, I would have known psychically anyway, but she told me that you ate it because I didn't realize that she was also in the house. And so I didn't feel safe because people, if someone's reporting me and my parents are reporting me, I didn't feel safe. So for me to actually say something in the hospital was, or before the hospital was a big thing. When I was released from the hospital, they said that they couldn't find anything physically wrong with me. And so I went home and my parents doted on me, which I appreciated that day. And I said to them, Mom and Dad, I need your help. I don't want to marry Dawn. And so I pleaded with them to help me. And they actually did cancel the marriage for me. And he was very, very angry, very upset. And so I thought at that point, I sort of hoped we would leave the group. But 2 weeks later, Dawn and John came to Sudbury again to do aura balances. And my mom said, well, I'm going to go and you should come with me because at some point you're going to have to face John. We're in the same group. So you should come with me. Well, I started to shake. I was terrified. I didn't want to see him, but I went because I needed to be the good and dutiful daughter. And so when we got there, we said hello. And again, I literally physically was shaking like a leaf. And he took me aside and said, I want to talk to you. And he started talking, but I was so afraid that I couldn't really see clearly. And then all of a sudden he grabs me and he kissed me. And it so horrified me that he was kissing me. I was so confused. And he said, I want to apologize for being hard on you. And I got inwardly, I didn't let him know this, but inwardly I was so angry that he reduced the cruelty that the things he would do and say to me, that he reduced it down to being hard on me. rather than what it was. And everything just sort of went white. And he was talking to me. I couldn't hear him. I was underwater. I couldn't see him. And then I sort of came to as he ushered me out from where we were. And he put his arm around me and he said, so the wedding's, and he announced to everyone there, so the wedding's back on. And
Gosh.
we get in the car to go home. And my mom said, what the hell's going on? I said, Mom, I don't want to marry him. I don't know what happened. I don't know why he said that. And we went home and my mom said, Bob, we have to cancel the marriage again. And he said, no, Brenda has made her bed. She can sleep in it. And she said, Bob, you're being ridiculous. We need to help her. Thank God she did. And so my dad eventually did cancel the marriage for me. And within a short period of time, Kollmar have had a lot of dissension with the co-leader, John Haynes, for a while now. John was a very peculiar fella. My sister always describes him as physically a little bit like Mr. Magoo and Hitler, if you melded the two. I did go to John at one point to say how terrified I was 15, how afraid I was of Don, and that I said he's very cruel to me. I finally worked up the courage to talk to him about it. And instead of helping me, he said, well, Brenda, that's because don't submit your will to him. You're resisting submitting your will, and you need to be more loving, gentle, and kind with him. And you're pulling this out of him because you're not submissive enough. So you're pulling all of this rage and anger and volatility out from him. He said, so you need to be more loving. And by the way, he said, we had been on a trip traveling, Dawn, John, and I, doing aura balances across the States. And he said, by the way, spending this time with you, I can really tell that you're very mature. And he had previously, since the time of being 13, I would meet with John alone. And he would tell me, when you turn 16, Brenda, you need to lose your virginity to a master. And he said, because this will really help raise your consciousness to a level that you could never reach yourself. So when you turn 16, you need to lose your virginity to a master. And he compared himself. He said, him being the master. He said, and I looked at him, and this was before. You have to understand let me just say about rape, that rape is not always, to be graphic, it's also digital penetration. So there was both with me, but this was before. This was just digital penetration with Kollmar. You can take that part out if you need to. But anyway, so he said, you're going to lose your virginity to me because I am like a sun compared to Kollmar that is like a candle flickering in the wind. And so you need to lose your virginity to me. And so now at 15, right on the heels of me asking him for help with how angry Dawn is, I said nothing about the sexual abuse, just about the emotional and mental. And he said, you're old enough now to lose your virginity to me. He never acted on it, but he was very angry with me for not, I think, saying okay. Like he was waiting for me to submit myself to him because he gave me heck for not submitting my will to him. He told me over and over in that conversation, you're not submitting your will to me either, and you must submit your will to me. And this is important spiritual information that you cannot share with anyone. You cannot share this. Normal people can't know this. So I had it from both leaders, and
That's yeah, that's they're complicit in their operation together. You know, I talked at the very start about whether these particular cult leaders knew what they were trying to do when they started this group, in terms of accessing vulnerable people to abuse them for their own personal pleasure. And I think both of them did know. Going by what I've heard in the Chasing Enlightenment podcast about the Students of Light, specifically about John Hannes, I do believe that these two were just two sick people that happened to find each other and have a recipe to exploit vulnerable people, both spiritually, sexually, and otherwise. And that's a bad combination when two predators that have influence and charisma come together in that sense. You do get kind of like triple fold layers of abuse happening on, and it's just so I do recommend the Chasing Enlightenment podcast, which I'll put a link to in the episode description for anyone that wants to hear more about the Students of Light. But you finally told your mum, I don't want this to happen. She says okay, then it's happening again, then it's not, then it's happening again, and then your dad says, well, she can't do this to us again because it's too embarrassing?
Well, it was more like, I want to wash my hands. I want to wash my hands of this. Like, you've made your bed, Brenda, as a child. I was only 16, and you've made your bed. You can sleep in it. And so my mom stepped forward and said, we've got to help her. And so they did cancel the marriage again. And at that, Dawn, again, was very angry about that, livid. But he also was having issues with John. There was dissension between them. And so he left. Not too many, maybe 2 months after that, he left the group entirely. He went back to Buffalo and slowly started a new group for himself at the helm. And then by the 90s, moved to Amsterdam. He has been doing the same type of work ever since, and he has followers now internationally. And his new group is called, I always forget, it's the acronym for, it's CSA, the same as child sexual assault. So something about raising consciousness. I don't know why I can never remember it. So I, at that point, thought we might just leave the group. I felt so free, being free of Kollmar. Oddly, when the second marriage was canceled, I felt like a fish out of water, because I was suddenly back at home with my family, living a normal life, and I didn't really know where I fit in with them. It was uncomfortable for me, but no one asked me a question. No one asked me what I had gone through, what it was like being with him. It was all like it just didn't happen. And then within a few months of that, my dad announced that he was going to be moving to Toronto. And so he sold our house, and we were going to move as a family. My older sister didn't want anything to do with it. So she was 18. She got her own little apartment. We were all ready to move, packed up. And I was not happy about moving. I didn't want to be a part of the group at that point, but I loved my family and I wanted to be with them. Literally days before we were ready to move, John called and said to my dad, Brenda's too filled with darkness. She's carrying Don Kollmar's consciousness and darkness, and she's not allowed to come because it'll be too disruptive to the group. So I don't know if she'll ever be able to come, but she can't come now. And so my mom was told to stay with me. And so my dad moved to Toronto. We rented a little apartment for a few months. I was in grade 11. By the time grade 11 was almost done, my mom said, I came home and she was packing the whole house up and the whole apartment up. And she said, I'm very angry with John for trying to separate me from my husband. And I'm moving to Toronto with my younger sister. And I don't know where you're going to live, but, you're not allowed to come. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm moving. My father ended up telling my older sister that I had to move in with her. And so here we are, a 18 and a 19-year-old, sharing our childhood bed again. So my parents left and I finished grade 12. They gave my sister a very nominal amount of money for food that barely covered it, but there was no support from me financially. It was like, you should be able to fend for yourself. So I didn't have a hat, a scarf, mitts. No, I had, thank God for my friends, because I made friends, that they gave me paper and a pencil and notebooks. Like, I had no money for anything, nor did my sister. She was young herself. And I just thought, well, I guess I'm here for the rest of my life. I didn't know what was going to be happening, but they called and said by the time I was graduating that it was time. John said it was time that I could move. And so I ended up moving to Toronto, moving in with my parents, who had only a 2-bedroom apartment, one bed for my sister and one room for them. So I started sleeping in my sister's room, and my parents very quickly said, you should be ashamed of yourself. You can't put your sister out like this. Why did you think you could live here, basically? And they were upset with me for assuming I could move in with them after graduating grade 12. So my older sister ended up moving to Toronto as well, and we lived again together. We were in the group, and I started to work in the restaurant right away, and she worked outside of the group. But within a period of time, within a few years, one of our head chefs left the group. And so they put me in that position, and I really excelled at it. I was really, really, really good. And I started to get a lot of magazines contacting me to appear in there. There was a lot of really great write-ups that were happening with my picture, and this did not sit well with the group. And we didn't have a lot of rules, but actual laws, but one law that was that there was a big meeting called that people used to call and say, so is Brenda the chef today? Is Brenda cooking today? What did she cook? And So people were told that you're not allowed to tell customers this anymore. And of course, being in the restaurant was my source of normalcy. I loved to talk to the customers and connect with them. So they all knew me from articles as well. And so they would say, "Oh, Brenda, what are you cooking tomorrow? I want to bring my friend over, and what are you going to make?" And I would have to not, people would be waiting for me to say something so that I would be in trouble. And I wasn't allowed, people weren't allowed to say anything. It was like too much attention on one person. And so that was one of the craziest laws. There was a lot of control in terms of who you were allowed to date, whether you were allowed to have children. I mean, they did control all sorts of things like that. People would ask, what color should I paint my house? And, not that it was enforced, but people certainly did do that. Always going to John for guidance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at one point, my abuse did come out, just a little bit came out, and it was like that Kollmar molested me was the term, and it never went further than that. I tried to share a few details, but I recall some people in my family would say, "Oh, and this is too hard to hear. I can't hear about this. It's too hard to hear." And so I wasn't ever given the opportunity to talk about it. But as soon as it came out, John, I wanted to go to the police. My dad actually said we should go to the police as well. And John came forward and said, "Absolutely not. It'll bring too much attention, negative attention to the group. The darkness will use it to get at the group and destroy it." So I was dissuaded. I was not allowed to go to the police. And he said, "Instead, we'll help you through this." And so John had a meeting with me, and several of his core group members, all separately, had meetings with me, and they all told me verbatim the exact same thing. And that was that, well, you were abused, and he sexually abused you, but he said you abused him far worse than he ever abused you because in previous lifetimes, one, this was your karma. You were very abusive to him in previous lifetimes. But in this lifetime, just to digress, one of the things that we were told also is that we were all fallen angels, and we all had certain negative energies that we brought to the world. And mine was being an enchantress. And they said, "You are an enchantress." And so you lured him to you. And you are responsible for his downfall in this lifetime. It was his time to come to the light and to grow spiritually and connect back with God like all of us were supposed to do. And you destroyed that for him, his life. And that is far more abusive than anything he did to you. And they told
my goodness.
And they told me my soul was so demented that I actually enjoyed the abuse. And the term they used was, "and you got off on it." And that's the one that really killed me. "And you got off on the abuse." So, and that was how they helped me through it. And so, of course, I didn't really say anything until many, many years later. I ended up going out with someone that I was not allowed to date in the group. I wanted to leave, but again, my family was there. But I ended up dating a core group member that was a big no-no. And so I apparently destroyed his life as well. We ended up getting married, and people started to shun us, and my family for that matter, because they attended the wedding, and we had a little tiny wedding. And so we all left the group by the time I was 28, and this was 1990. And so we all left the group as a family. 6 years later, we all tried to sort of, my dad was in a good position. He had a great job, and so he was okay. But, I certainly struggled for a number of years trying to find employment. Finally, though, I was settled in life. And 6 years later, after leaving the group, I decided it was time for me to go to police, and I reported it in 97. Not a lot happened. There was an arrest warrant issued, though. They believed my story. They were supportive, but no one really did anything because he was in the U.S. and I think it was a big job to sort of move forward with it. So nothing really happened with it. And then in 2017, constable reopened my file and called me and said, "Are you interested in reopening it?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Great. He's doing the same thing. We found his website." I said, "Yes, I've seen his website as well." He was the same type of New Age rhetoric stuff. And so, but then after asking me, he didn't do anything. And because I had been let down in 20 years prior in 97, I really pressed, but he wasn't doing anything for about 2 years. I went to his sergeant finally, and they I felt like I was being catfished all the time. It was like, yeah, I'm going to do it. But then he would never do anything. And so anyway, an arrest warrant was issued, and I knew he was going to be in California, Santa Cruz. So they arranged with the Crown, or you do too, the Crown attorney arranged to extradite him. And he was arrested when he had done his seminar. He was back on his way to Amsterdam, and they arrested him. And he took the next 3 years. He fought it with top-notch lawyers, both there and here. And but he lost that case, and so he was extradited. By the time he got here, though, with really great lawyers, it was about 8 months that he was here. His bail in the U.S. was set at $4 million, which was a really high amount. Their DOJ did a phenomenal job representing me because I, could read everything. They were just phenomenal. But anyway, when he came here, it was really like a technicality that he got let go. They couldn't really... because of the amount of time that was taken, but, from the arrest warrant to when they actually went to trial, there was too much time. So he had to be let go. We had a Supreme Court ruling in 2016 called the Jordan ruling that set time limits on all of these things. So that was able to be used, and he was released. So he's back in Amsterdam living his life, and I had to pick the pieces up, which, of course, my whole life has sort of been a healing, but, you move forward. And I got a call a year after he was released to say that the constable that was on my case that opened my file up, they had charged him. The Toronto Police Tribunal had charged him for neglect of my case, basically. And he had 3 charges against him. And they said, you're going to have to be a witness. This was just late last month. You're going to have to be a witness to talk about, what happened. And you can do a victim impact statement. So I was really looking forward to seeing if something came of that, because it was very devastating. I was treated very badly by him. I won't get into that whole story, but there was a lot to it. And so I felt like, well, maybe there'll be a little bit of justice there. But days before his trial was to commence in late January, he resigned. And so once he resigned, they have no jurisdiction over him to do anything with these charges. So he had pleaded not guilty. So we thought that it was going to move forward. But once he resigned, that was it. So now that's it. And I'm here to continue with life and to heal. And one of the things that I said earlier was that I've felt like I was so helped by programs like yours, listening to other people's experiences. It's so validating, especially learning about narcissism, and where I think that is where so many of these cult leaders come from. Their power and their wrath and their rage really stems from deep-rooted narcissism. So programs like this, it's really been helpful for me. So I hope that my story in some way will give people strength. Even though I didn't have a great experience with the judicial system, I still recommend that people go through the system, but they need to know what to expect. I wish that we were, as victims, more well-versed in how to move forward with this type of case and with a cult group. There's so many layers to it, but especially the sexual assault. I think there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen. I don't want to dissuade someone. They have to do what is comfortable for them. I don't want to dissuade anyone, but there is a sense of getting it out there, having people know the truth, especially when you've been, like me, suppressed from ever speaking about it.
Closely with Carol Murchison, who's somebody that we've had on the podcast as well. I don't know if you just wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm sure that you two connected through this legal process, because that's what Carol does for her work. But it's very specific in niche, and she's doing something that not many people are doing. So I didn't know if you just wanted to throw that out there for anyone listening that it might be relevant to.
Yes. Well, Carol is, she's a wonderful woman. And I always say, when I'm talking about her, she's the type of woman I want to be when I grow up. I love her. She's so kind and knowledgeable, and wise, very wise. But yes, she works with, I think her background was working with corporations and helping them to implement systems for how to deal with sexual assault within their companies and so forth. And she took her, I think, her corporate experience and then was trying to apply that or within cults, because there are so many cults that are massive organizations that are like corporations, and they have no policies in place on how to deal with sexual assault and abuse. And it's so prevalent in virtually every cult. I think that this is happening.
From my understanding, Carol is working in a legal capacity to bring cases against spiritual and religious abuse in cultic groups. So if somebody has experienced any form of sexual abuse, sexual violence, sexual harassment within a faith-based setting, of any kind of faith-based setting, then Carol is working with a team to bring cases against those abusers. That's my understanding, although it might have changed.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you. Thank you for those words. That's exactly what it is, yes. And in my case, that is how we connected, and she was incredibly supportive. We didn't move forward with anything, but she's been there in other ways for me, so I thank her for that.
So incredibly important work, especially if people have watched documentaries like The Vow about NXIVM. It's without laws in countries to protect people from cults. Even our coercive and controlling behavior legislation over here only protects people in a domestic capacity. So we can't prosecute coercive control in a group capacity, like the students of light. We couldn't bring a lawsuit against a group in that sense, even if it was to target the leader. So with that, if you can find some type of crime that has been committed that does have legislation written for it, like human trafficking in Keith Raniere's case and other associated crimes, you can bring a lawsuit against that person. But it's so difficult to prove and prosecute cases like that because a lot of the time leadership will have a lot of, what is sometimes known as flying monkeys. They'll have a lot of people doing things for them, running things, bank accounts in different people's names and, kind of acting without impunity because they have other people carrying out things for them or protecting them and giving character statements and all sorts of things. So even if you have a case like you have here against Don, it's so difficult to prosecute even still. We just talked about a technicality, which is heartbreaking. But if you Google his name now, all that comes up are just all these court files and everything is public record. You can read about this man that wants a job in your workplace, for example, or somebody that's offering crystal healing classes, and you're like, oh, I'm going to Google this guy and wonder, who's left him reviews. All of a sudden, you're reading about child sexual abuse on the internet with his name attached to those files, which is one small positive that can be taken from that entire situation, I think. I don't know how you feel. That's just me talking for you, which I apologize for.
Yes, it is prevalent. And it's not like I am saying, even though I'm talking about him and using his name, this is all public knowledge. And I did have the publication ban lifted for that reason so that I would be able to talk about my case. So it was lifted by the Crown, thank goodness. And, interestingly, you talk about people supporting him, about, again, all public record, about 30 of his followers did write very long letters to the judge defending him and talking about what a wonderful man he is, and that this must be, that I'm just out for revenge or vengeance. And just some of the things that were being said were so outlandish. But they really do believe that he is a very high spiritual being and talk about it and say he is, he's a healer. He's like a healer. He's healed me. And one woman specifically said, I work with children and I was sexually assaulted myself as a child. So I would know she's imploring the judge that she would know. It's like, Well, if you know, then you really need to contact the FBI and work with them for all of these people that are accused, if you know for sure, and tell them, yeah, he did it. It's not something you can tell. And clearly, some of the most revered people have done terrible things. And it's just a fact of life. So it is in every aspect of life. It's in every religion. It's in schools. It doesn't matter where you go. When you look at the statistics, how many children are assaulted, and across the board, mostly women though, it is terrifying that this isn't considered an epidemic, with governments involving themselves in trying to educate or do something to be more supportive of victims, because it is everywhere. And certainly just because you're a spiritual group or a religious-based group does not mean your people are any better or any more spiritual and protective. It's across the board.
We've mentioned a few times throughout our conversation that there were not many people that were advocating for your protection as a child. Do you think that's changed now that you are an adult on your journey of healing and recovery?
Within the group, within the existing group?
No, just kind of like out, I'd say like very far outside of that group, very far outside of that group.
Yeah, I do have my sister, as I said, with whom I live now. We share a home and we're in business together. And so she has been my advocate through all of this. Thank goodness. It's been painful because I love my family, but there are ways about them that they cannot seem to understand or hear me. The goalposts are always moved. There's perceived conflict where there just simply is no conflict. So I'm always in a state of, what did I do? What happened? And so I've had to really I've completely pulled back from them, which again it's painful because I love them and I care about them. But it has been so toxic and painful for me to be in their presence that I cannot do that. I need to heal and find validation, self-validation, and heal myself and give myself that time, and that I'm allowed to take time to heal. So I do have my sister who is with me, and her daughter is very supportive. So we have each other. We have each other's back. I think that it's really unfortunate in terms of whether or not things have changed over the time since the 70s when I went through this, in the 80s. While certain things have changed, I think that not a lot has changed. We can talk about it a little bit more, thank goodness, but I think it's happening just as much, sad.
It's worrying to think about teachers not picking up on signs, and hospitals not picking up on signs, and wondering how many people are still in those situations where they're not being seen or they're not having people advocate for them. And that's a scary thing. We talk about how things haven't changed much, and even though there's a lot of safeguarding policies and procedures in place, it's still a scary thing. It's something that scares me all the time. With my 2 young children, I'm always thinking, how can I keep them safe? How can I make sure that you can't be with them all the time? They go off to school and I'm like, oh, is everything going to be okay? And, and eventually they'll start asking to go to sleepovers and stuff. And that's a whole other thing. It's a difficult world to navigate, and how horrible is that? You just don't know what dangers are out there.
I think the most important thing is really talking to children. I know we hear that all the time. Talk to your children, but really talk to them and ask them questions and let them be gentle and give them time to say it, because they may want to say it, and you may sit there for 5 minutes and then just gently again ask them, because it's hard for them. They don't have the words. I did not have the vernacular at 13 years old to say what was happening to me. How do you tell your parents or your family that the person that they revere and put up on a pedestal is cruel to you and is abusing you? How do you say this? I didn't have the words. And so just letting children know, whether they're yours or not, if you interact with them, make sure you ask them and give them time. It's the time that you need to give them to answer, and if you ask them more than once, sometimes it takes several times to say, I am here. You can say anything to me that you need to. I am here for you. So I think in that case, it would have helped me.
I think that's a really powerful thing to end our conversation on today. I think that's absolutely, if I'd like to say it should be a fundamental part of the relationships that we have with our children, but of course that's not always the case. But thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you for coming and sharing your experiences with us. Thank you for talking about important issues that I imagine are always going to be difficult for you to speak about, and for allowing us to hear firsthand about some of the things that are still happening in the world. You know, the people are still experiencing. These stories are so powerful, and they do validate people and they do educate people, but I don't ever underestimate how difficult they must be to kind of re-experience as you talk about them. So thank you so much for your time today, Brenda, and for coming and sharing with the listeners.
Thank you for having me. And I want to say thank you for the work you do. It's invaluable. It really is. It helps a lot of people. So I don't know if you hear that enough, but it really does. And it has helped me. So thanks again.
Thanks so much, Brenda. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
I will. You take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.